Listen, it's not my fault that the people are a fan of you. It's not my fault. You're just so dang cute. Welcome back to the channel, and I hope you're excited for today's lesson. So my name is Emily. I'm gonna be your flight instructor, sim instructor. I don't know, what should we call me? Laid off pilot, instructor, flight simulator enthusiast, one of those names. Welcome back to the channel for another Flight Simulator 2020 tutorial. So as it has been highly requested, you have been asking me to kind of reel it back in a little bit. A lot of you enjoyed the full IFR tutorial, the G1000 tutorial, but many of you mentioned that it was still a bit more high level than some of the tutorials that you were hoping to see. So because of that, I figured I would kind of bring it back and go back to some fundamentals of flight, some more basics of flying, so that you can apply those kind of foundational skills onto other portions of the Flight Sim 2020. Please subscribe to the channel if you enjoyed seeing this kind of content. Please take a look at the description box below. There's gonna be lots of links to some old videos and a lot of answers to some of the questions that you may have. So make sure that you check that out. Okay, so now that we're ready to get started, I wanted to first cover some basic definitions, and then I'll give you a demonstration in the actual flight sim itself. So the first definition that I wanted to cover is taxiing. And I know that sounds super basic for some of you guys, but there's numerous people who aren't aware that taxiing is actually an aircraft's movement on the ground. So when we talk about taxiing, we're referring to us kind of moving from the apron area or moving along a taxiway and setting yourself up for departure, or after the landing, taxiing back to your gate or to your hangar, wherever that may be. So this is applicable for you guys if you're using rudder pedals, or if you're obviously using just a joystick like myself. So your taxiing is going to be slightly different, because taxiing in the real aircraft is actually done through the rudder pedals themselves. So there's actually, through a linkage system that's connected to the nose wheel of most small aircraft, as you're moving your rudder pedals around with your heels, you're actually going to be pulling or pushing the nose wheel in the direction that you are hoping to move. So in my instance right now, I'm going to be using the twisting motion to actually taxi my aircraft along the ground. But for many of you guys that are using rudder pedals, it's actually going to be using either your right foot to be turning the nose wheel towards the right, or your left one to be going towards the left. Now, a quick tip for you guys as you're starting to taxi, typically you want to just stay neutral. So you don't want to be constantly overcorrecting. Most of your foot pressure should be onto your heels, and your heels should be on the floor. So you don't want to be kind of elevating and putting a lot of pressure onto your heels. Your heels should be on the ground. And then as you're applying pressure, you want to try to make sure that it's nice and consistent, and that if you're trying to correct with the other direction, that you're actually lessening the pressure from the opposite side, so that you're not kind of pushing against your own feet. So let's take a look at what that looks like in the aircraft itself. So to start taxiing forward, I'm going to be checking to make sure that my brakes aren't on. And in this case, if you're using rudder pedals, your brakes are actually going to be toe brakes. So they're actually going to be at the top part of the rudder pedals themselves. So make sure that you lift your toes, or that you also don't have your parking brake accidentally on. It's definitely happened to all of us. So once you see that that's done, you can start adding a little bit of throttle to start your aircraft moving forward. Now, typically for small aircraft, you can start the initial adding of power, and then you can reduce it once you've gotten over the initial inertia. And then as you're taxiing along and you're following your yellow line, which gives you proper wing clearance on either side, you can then move your aircraft about. So we're just going to taxi along straight forward. And we can keep an eye out to make sure that we're on the actual line. Now, of course, this isn't realistic, but in the sim, you can use that. Just had some flaps down. So for myself, if you are like me and you don't have rudder pedals, you can just use slight twisting motions with the actual joystick itself on the right side, and move your nose about. So here we're just going to practice just taxiing onto the runway. I don't have a clearance, but it's fine just for simulation here. We're just going to start our aircraft turn to the left. So I'm just going to start rotating to the left. And again, if you were using your rudder pedals, you'd be using your left foot and then canceling it out. And let's just say that I want to taxi just onto the right here. I could do so by twisting now to the right. And you can actually see in the aircraft, the rudder pedals are moving accordingly. So it kind of gives you an idea of what it would actually look like. Oh, a little bit more power here. Oh, I'm still getting used to the twisting motion, but you guys kind of get the idea. Now, if I wanted to slow down and stop my aircraft, you're first going to reduce your throttle. Obviously, you don't want to be adding brakes against the throttle power itself, and then you can start using your brakes. Now, for myself, I've set it up to a specific button, but of course, in a situation where you're using rudder pedals, you're just going to be using both even pressure on the top portions of the rudder pedals for your brakes. And then once you've stopped, you can just set your parking brake. So I mentioned this example, it's obviously for a much smaller aircraft. So for today, we're in a 152. I actually did my training initially in a 150. So this is quite similar to what I did my initial training in. But of course, if you are flying a much larger aircraft, you're most likely going to be actually taxiing around with a tiller. So some aircraft have tillers on both the captain side and the first officer side, and some of them have them only on the captain side. And the tiller really is just instead of using your feet to control the rudder pedals, you're actually going to be using the hand till to move your aircraft around. Now, it actually gives you much more flexibility in terms of turn radius instead of just trying to use your rudder pedals only. There is also another skill that you can potentially try to test out if you do have the pedals. I can't really do it for myself, but it is called differential braking. So in the event that you're trying to actually decrease your turn radius, so you're trying to do a really sharp turn in one direction, you can actually use a combination of your rudder as well as using the brake on either side of the aircraft. So in this case, if we're using the example of turning to the right, we wanted to make it a really nice and tight right turn, we could actually just turn and use our right rudder, but we'd actually also brake with the right side so that it would actually just seize the right, not seize, but it would stop the wheel from moving on the right side and actually just move yourself about so that this wheel is stationary and the other wheel moves. So if you guys have rudder pedals, you can definitely test it out for yourselves and see if you can decrease how wide your turn radius is. Okay, so now that we've talked a little bit about taxiing and moving about on the different taxiways or the different aprons, I just wanted to give you guys an example of different taxiway signs. So here on the screen, I've just kind of zoomed it out so we can have a better perspective, but I wanted to show you guys this first example of a taxiway sign. So the black outline is going to be the taxiway that you're currently on. So right now we know that we are on taxiway Bravo. And then we see that there's 3 different options for taxiway Charlie. So the way that you can break this down is that you know that Charlie is going to be all surrounding you. So Charlie with the arrow backwards is talking about this taxiway here. So this is Charlie. Taxiway Charlie that is going to be ahead of you, actually, if I'm not mistaken, it blends into Charlie at the end here. And then you also have taxiway Charlie that is right here. Another thing to take a look at is we can see that we have some hold short lines here ahead of us. So it's just warning you that you are going to be coming onto an active runway or a departure path of sorts. We can also see here that it is indicating to us which runway that is. So we see that in this case, if I zoom in, we can actually see that it is runway 21 and runway 03. So that's actually this runway just to our left. It is also indicated with this one ahead. Oh, I'm sorry. I just realized the mistake I was making. Bravo actually ends here and Charlie actually continues this way here. So that's why it probably got split into a different taxiway, because they probably started adding more taxiways as the airport grew a little bit. So we see that we have runway 2103, and then we can see that here it's an unused taxiway. It's actually an X in the distance here. So hopefully that gives you guys a bit of an idea of some taxiway signs to get familiar with. And a tip for you guys, I would highly recommend, if you're able to go and check out skyvector.com and maybe just download the aerodrome or the airport chart that you're going to be taxiing in. Obviously using the G1000 is quite helpful because it does have the live GPS positioning and it can show you where you are. It doesn't show the taxiways, but if you have the airport diagram to your side somewhere and then you're also using the G1000, it can obviously benefit you in terms of situational awareness. So an aircraft has 3 different axes axes that it can move about. The three of them are your longitudinal axis. Wait, I need a prop. Okay, prop time. So the aircraft can move about three different axes. So the longitudinal axis is going to be the axis that actually goes along the length of the aircraft. You also then have your lateral axis, which is going to be from wingtip to wingtip. And then lastly, we also have our normal axis, or the vertical axis, excuse me, that goes right through the middle of the aircraft this way. So remember those different axes, because now we're going to talk about the movements, and the movements are relative to those axes I just described. So let's talk about the three different types of movements now that are associated with this. So first I talked about the longitudinal axis. So the movement that is associated with that is going to be the roll movement. So rolling your aircraft to the left or to the right. The other one that we can talk about is going to be the lateral axis, which is going to be the pitching movement about the lateral axis. And then lastly, the last movement, which is not something that we create, it's something that we actually control. It is the yawing movement. So the movement about the vertical axis in this direction. So now that we've covered all the different movements, let's talk about what you actually do to establish those movements. So we talked about first the longitudinal axis, which has the rolling movement, and that's actually going to be with you establishing either a left or a right bank attitude by using your control column either left or right. So that is going to be this way, and the control surfaces that are responsible for that are actually going to be your ailerons. So you've probably seen them before. Your ailerons are going to be deflecting either left or right depending on the direction of roll that you're trying to establish. We have our lateral axis, which has the pitch movement, and that's actually established by either pulling back or pushing forward onto your control column, so making the aircraft pitch up or down as a movement, and that's actually established or created by the control surfaces, which are your elevators, that is located on the tail of the aircraft. So either on the horizontal stabilizer like this, or it might be on a lower different type of tail, depending on, again, the aircraft that you're flying. And then the last movement that we talked about, again, I mentioned that it is about the vertical axis, and it's an undesired state. It's typically called adverse yaw. So it's the tendency for an aircraft that's rigid for it to actually go into the opposite direction of a roll. So in this case, if we were to roll the aircraft to the left, naturally the nose is actually going to want to point to the opposite direction as you do so. And that's just due to the differences in the lift that's being created by either of the wings. But to be able to control that or to counteract that, we're actually going to be using our feet or the rudder pedals to actually be moving the rudder, which is also located on the tail of the aircraft. So to establish a turn procedure, which is now a more complex maneuver, we're actually going to be using a combination of both the rolling movement as well as the yaw tendency to correct it so that it actually turns in the direction of, actually heads in the direction of the turn. Okay, so now that I've used my prop, let's do a couple demos in the flight sim itself. Okay, so what we're gonna do now is I'm actually just going to change airports, and we're gonna be departing out of Calgary, and I'm going to do a takeoff, and then once we're airborne and cruising, we'll go on to the second part of today's lesson. All right, let's do this. Yes, yes, I've been cleared for takeoff. We're doing basic lessons, okay? Calm yourself. So what we're gonna do is I'm just gonna climb out. We're just gonna head to a spot where we don't see the mountains. We're just gonna head to an area where our view is not obstructed by anything. And then I'm going to start talking about our next lesson. Okay, so the first thing that we're gonna be talking about, like I said, is attitudes and movements. So Emily, what is an attitude? An attitude is basically the orientation of the aircraft or your aircraft relative to the horizon. And then what is the horizon? The horizon is essentially where the sky meets the earth. And that's why I was mentioning earlier that it was probably a good idea to head to a destination where it's not going to be obstructed by buildings or a city or mountains in the background, because you do want a nice and level horizon to be referencing to. And why is it important to learn all these different attitudes that I'm going to be going through? It's important because these are essentially the foundation of all other phases, or all phases of flight that you're going to be building on. So your takeoff, your cruise, your descent, and your landing, as well as your flare and your touchdown and all that. There are 3 different basic attitudes. It's going to be broken down into your cruise attitudes, your nose up and nose down attitude, and then lastly, your bank attitudes. So as you guys see on the screen, the first attitude that we're going to be talking about is your cruise attitude. Now, your cruise attitude is your reference for every other attitude that you're going to be establishing. Now, as a fun tip or an activity, I don't know if you want to do this with like your kids or your significant other or like your pet or something, but one activity that I used to love to teach or to give to my students when I was a flight instructor was to, and you guys don't have to do this, but if you guys are really wanting to memorize these, especially when you're not necessarily playing the game, what I would recommend is actually getting a printout, like literally a screenshot of the aircraft that you're currently practicing on. So it could be the 152 in this case, it could be the 172, but you're going to get the picture that you're seeing on the screen right now. And then you're going to also get a picture, so 2 different printouts of the horizon. What you're going to do with the first one, the first cutout screen, or the screen, sorry, you're actually going to cut the entire windscreen portion out. So you can leave the magnetic compass in if you want, but you're just going to cut around and then get 2 like clear laminated like those like dividers or those separators, and put both of your pictures in those clear dividers. And what you're going to have is basically be able to use both those pictures and move them around against one another so that you can visualize the different attitudes. And the reason why it's a good suggestion is because you want to be able to establish these without even second guessing. So if I were to eventually tell you, hey, go ahead and set up a gentle nose up with a medium left bank attitude, you're going to know exactly how to move those pictures so that you can actually replicate that in the flight sim. And that's really important because it's going to be the different setups, like when you're going to be doing your left turn onto your circuit pattern, or maybe you're doing a descending turn as you're turning and intercepting a final approach slope or final approach path. So again, it's really important so that you can build on these skills to then translate them over onto other facets of your flight sim. The cruise attitude is really going to be your baseline, like I said. So as a general consensus, most people would recommend that you typically see about a fist of space between your dash, so the bottom, the bottom portion of the dash, and the horizon. So as you're seated properly, and if you're doing this for real flight training, make sure that your flight instructor is actually checking your seat height, because it actually makes a huge difference, especially if you're struggling with landings. Make sure you're seated at the proper position, and then sit comfortably and look to see whether or not the horizon crosses your fingers, or like the top of your fingers with about 4 fingers above the dash. So that's your reference point for cruise. So this is typically kind of what we're seeing right now. Another thing that's going to come along with your cruise attitude is going to be having your wings leveled. So we can obviously see that right now. My wings relative to the horizon are nice and flush. There is no angle up or down, and there's going to be a constant RPM. So you're not really accelerating or decelerating. It's just a cruise attitude, and that's the baseline. Now let's talk about your different nose up and nose down attitudes. So the second attitude that you can have. So we can split your nose up and nose down attitudes into 3 further attitudes. So I'm going to be demonstrating all of them so that you can then practice them at home. So we talked about how this would be our normal cruise attitude. Now, if we pitch our nose up a tiny bit, so if we pull back on the control column or your yoke, we can see now that my attitude is a little bit changed. I see that it's almost just meeting the horizon. So my dashboard is now flush with the horizon, and we would call this a gentle nose up attitude. And this is going to be associated with like a gentle climb or an en route climb as well. So then once we're happy with that, we can return back to cruise. And you always want to go back to cruise to get remind yourself of the baseline. The next one would be your medium nose up attitude. So gentle was between, 5 degrees of pitch up. Your medium is going to be between 5 to 10 degrees. So it would look something like, say, this. Let me see on the outside if it shows us a little bit more. So this would be like a medium nose up attitude. That's actually kind of neat to be able to see it from the outside. And the medium nose up attitude, as a reference, I like to kind of visualize that my horizon is actually crossing the top portion of, or the top or the mid portion of my first row of instruments. Again, this is going to depend on what aircraft that you're training in, but the 172, the 152, these are both going to be interchangeable in terms of the aircraft and the examples that I'm giving. So this would be more your medium nose up attitude. So again, 5 to 10 degrees of nose up. Oh, I wasn't pitching up. Apparently I'm too high. My performance is crap here. Okay. All right. So we go back to our cruise attitude. And then lastly, we're going to finish up with a steep nose up attitude, which is greater than 10 degrees of nose up. So of course, this is what it would look like instead. And I would then say to people, look for the horizon crossing between the middle portion of your 6-pack instrument. And then back to cruise attitude. So those were the 3 different nose up. And then of course, we're gonna have the same 3 nose down attitudes, but instead pitching your nose down. So starting from cruise, we're gonna go to a gentle nose down. So a gentle nose down would look something like this. So instead of having just your 4 fingers or your fist, it might be like a 5th finger on top or just like a little bit more. So something greater than cruise and greater than what we were practicing earlier. And then back to your cruise attitude. Medium nose down is gonna be between 5 to 10 degrees of nose down. So now we're starting to see that the horizon and the ground is getting a larger in sight. So we push the nose down, houses get bigger, that whole thing. So medium nose down attitude, we're starting to see more of like a 60% sky, 40% ground. And then back to your cruise attitude. And then lastly, for your steep nose down, so it's greater than 10 degrees, we're gonna be looking about 50% sky and ground. So I'm just gonna decrease, well, we have a nice friend coming to join us for our lessons. I'm just gonna decrease the throttle a little bit and then pitch my nose forward. So again, press forward on my control column, and there's more of my steep nose down attitude. I'm gonna go back to cruise a little bit. There we go. So those were the cruise attitudes as well as the nose up and nose down. So now that we've recovered from that, we can talk about the final attitudes, which are our bank attitudes. And again, there's going to be 3 different kinds of bank attitudes. So going back to our level flight, or cruise attitude, I should say, we're going to be breaking them down into our gentle, medium, and steep bank attitudes. So using your control column or your yoke, whichever one that you have, you're going to be establishing a bank attitude. So bank attitude is going to be either left or right direction. And again, we're going to be breaking them down into degrees. So still staying in a cruise attitude, so not pitching up or pitching down, you're going to be increasing your bank to, first let's start to 15 degrees or less. So 15 degrees bank is going to be your gentle bank attitude. So something like this would be a gentle bank. Now I want to see if I can pause it. There we go. So we can see here as I'm banked into this attitude, we see that the horizon is just on a very slight angle. So you can almost see that it's like just kind of meeting. I think if we stand up properly, there we go. If we look at the horizon or where the dash is meeting, it's just meeting on the corner. So that's just your gentle bank attitude. So if I'm going to go to the left, I need to roll my aircraft. Once I'm happy with the angle, I actually need to cancel the input. Otherwise, it will continue to increase. And then if I want to roll out, I actually go into the opposite direction. So roll to the right to level the wings. Let's do that one more time just because I didn't do it that well here. So I'm going to roll to the left, cancel my input. And then once I'm done with my bank, I'm actually going to roll to the right and then neutralize my inputs once again. And then we try and do a medium bank. We're actually going to be increasing it between 15 to 30 degrees. And again, I'm using all references outside because I want you guys to be able to reference the outside picture and not your instruments. You can of course confirm that, but I'd rather you memorize the outside picture so that you're really good at it. So in this case here, this would be your medium bank attitude. And again, we now see that the horizon is kind of crossing with close to the midpoint of our dash. So that's another good reference point to be able to use. And we can actually confirm that I am at the 30-degree mark. So anywhere between 15 to 30 degrees. So this is your medium bank attitude. And then coming back to cruise. And then lastly, let's do a steep bank attitude, which is going to be anything greater than 30 degrees. And typically when you're doing your flight training, you're aiming for about 45 degrees of bank. So let's try that to the right, or to the left, excuse me. And for a steep, we're actually going to be needing to pitch our nose up a tiny bit because we're losing some lift. And this is what your steep, oh, I'm having a hard time controlling this. Something like this. So a steep, oh, that's really weird to stop in mid-flight. So a steep bank attitude, it's not going to be perfect right now. Apparently we're turning, but it's anything greater than 30 degrees. And we can see really that the dash is now, we're looking more to the sky and we're on a much steeper bank attitude. There we go, we can come back to our cruise. Now you can practice doing them all on to the right as well and looking for the same markers. Now, something to keep in mind, depending on the seating position that you're gonna have, so of course if you're doing your training, you're gonna be mostly in the left seat, but if you were to become a flight instructor or you're going onto the right seat, then your pictures or your reference points are gonna be completely different because you're on the opposite side. The same rules apply, you just have to memorize what each picture is for the different seating position. Something also that I wanted to bring up as well is please don't focus on the instruments, especially at first. It's really easy to get sidetracked and to stare, especially if you're looking like this, say. But I really found, especially when I was teaching, that it's really, really important to be able to look everything outside first to be able to reference your points so that you can really nail and understand what the aircraft is doing, instead of relying on the instrumentation. Now, if you want to confirm that you're doing something correctly or that something is being replicated, by all means, go ahead. And I can, if you guys are interested, I can maybe do a more in-depth conversation about the different instruments. But for now, especially when you're starting at first, it's really, really important to be focused outside, not inside. All right, everybody, I think that completes the lesson for today. And now I know it was probably super basic, and I know for you pros out there that have been flight simming for a long time, you probably didn't get that much out of it. But for people who are just starting out, I think it's really important to start with a solid foundation. So hopefully this video was educational. Hopefully you guys see that onto the next lesson, we're actually gonna be building on top of this. So you guys will hear me use those same terms that we just talked about for today onto the next lesson. And you guys will see that I'll be able to add this to your takeoffs, add this towards your approach and towards your landing. So I can coach you guys or teach you guys how to approach properly and go for some actual decent landings in the flight sim. So I hope this video was beneficial to you guys. Thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate all the comments and the positive feedback that you guys always give me. Give this video a like if you appreciate it and you want me to build on top of this. It's really important for me to know that I'm creating the content that you guys all want to see. So thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video.